I'm Erin with Hail Varsity, joined by Brandon, also of Hail Varsity, and we are here to talk recruiting. Let's just dive right into it. It's Monday. Brandon, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. I was really struggling with that intro to this video. I'm still kind of struggling. I can tell it's Monday, but it's not a bad Monday. It just feels like we are in the time crunch before this season is here. It might be mid-July, but we are officially a week out essentially from the start of football, like football preparation, I should say, for Nebraska. So for anyone who's watching, who's going, how much time do we have left? Just about a week. And Nebraska will be at Big Ten Media Days, reporting for fall camp, fan day. All of it is happening very, very soon. And so I don't know about you, Brandon, but like that is partially where my brain is at right now, is like so much to do, so little time.
Yeah, that's definitely where I'm at too. The news cycle is stretching right now, getting ready to begin full season workouts next week. And yeah, it's weird. I know this happened last year with the week 0 game 2, where technically we got this started in July, but it still feels a little bit strange to be there, because starting next week we got media days, and then fall camp is going. So it'll be the usual practice availability schedule. Well, I don't know exactly what the availability schedule will be, but there will be continual updates on everything that's going on. And obviously an interesting camp with as many new faces as Nebraska has in there. So it's it starts next week.
It really does. In fact, I actually just went and looked. So for reference point, in years past, and I kind of knew this, and I think this is what is making this all feel really condensed, is Nebraska or all Big Ten schools were at media days this week, whether it was like the beginning or the end of the week. And then fall camps would start in the week or two to come, depending on if they had a week 0 or week 1 game. Obviously with SEC media days this week, you're not really interested in going head to head with that. You want those two to sort of live independently from one another. So I think what is making this feel very condensed for us, and I think you're going to see for anyone watching a lot of this across the board, is I have never seen a media day, fan day hybrid in the way that we are going to experience next week. Nebraska will fly to Indianapolis on Monday, spend one night, get up and do all of their obligations first thing in the morning. The only school that's going to be doing those obligations first thing in the morning, the moment that Frost is done speaking at the primary podium after Big Ten Commissioner Kevin Warren, they're going to get back on a plane, fly back to Lincoln, and they're going to be back to Lincoln in time for the team to report for fall camp that evening. And then fan day is also that evening, starting at 6 p.m. Central. So it's going to be a wild one. And so interestingly enough, this does work really well. When we talk about kind of a time crunch and we look at specifically recruiting, and I actually last week did do a recruiting notebook on the current calendar. And if you're kind of wondering where things are at, dead periods versus quiet periods and all of that, you can go check that out at hailvarsity.com. But specifically looking at the prospects, the recruits themselves and what they're up against, they've got to be feeling a bit of a time crunch as well, because I have now seen this topic being talked about by multiple people. I've seen some comments from some of our viewers, people who follow us on Twitter, just basically saying, are there going to be spots like available for commitments if they wait? And honestly, I think there are going to be I do think we're going to watch some players lose their spots the longer they wait. That just feels like where we're headed with this. Nebraska is in a really good position with its recruiting class at this point. I would say they would still keep room for a guy, say like Malachi Coleman. If he wants to make that decision in December, he will still have a spot. But I would say if there's anybody who's kind of like maybe not, in the top like 3 players on Nebraska's list right now, anyone on the outside of that is probably on the outside looking in. But it's not just the case with Nebraska. It's looking that way across the board with most programs right now.
Yeah, it really is. In the case of Nebraska, you mentioned Malachi Coleman. That's obviously somebody you're holding a spot for. I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that. And the timeline of his decision. Last we knew, looking towards a December commitment date, which is his preferred timeline. So Nebraska knows that, and they know he's a high priority prospect, and obviously being in state adds to that as well. So you hold that. And I mean, I think like everything else in college football, the transfer portal changes so much about this because, okay, let's say Nebraska's kind of reserving that spot. Like I'd be, we'll see. And some players pop up and you get in with a guy and they're just talented enough that it's a no brainer. But wide receiver, if you're looking at holding one spot for a specific prospect, maybe you don't end up with him. Whatever happens. Well, then all of a sudden, like that happens in December, you're not stuck. You're not waiting to kind of pick through whoever is held out and plans to sign in February because you got the transfer portal. And that starts really even before, like 2 weeks before early signing period, which complicates things. Last year, and I know QB recruiting is a little bit different because those guys tend to commit early. But Adrian Martinez, even taking time after last season to make his decision, was in the portal by December 2nd. And Nebraska had new additions, at that point. So really, once you hit that last regular season game, depending on what the bowl situation for these teams are, like the transfer recruiting piece of this, like starts immediately, which I think is why you see teams have always wanted to, in the early signing period, get as much of this wrapped before season as they can. And, something I wrote about last week too, in one of those notebooks, is like just how unique this is for Nebraska at this point to be this far ahead, which is really, I think, where you want to be. And it does kind of put a crunch on, if you're one of those guys who, Nebraska's offered, they're interested in you, they'll take you if you're ready to commit. But there's some other guys in that same spot. There's a real first mover advantage for those guys who can make their decision.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've seen a lot of people saying is if you don't have a school that is actively after you, really pushing for you right now, you're kind of hitting into a time period where your spot, that window might be closing. And if you have offers, you might want to be looking at those offers real seriously, because I also mentioned this to Brandon. The COVID situation and the extra COVID years is also going to be really making rosters interesting for the foreseeable future, because that wasn't just a one and done type of situation. Every player who is on a roster in that 2020 season has the option to use an extra COVID year if they want to. What ends up happening is, in a sense, what's happening to Nebraska right now. You have 87 on a scholarship players on a roster that can only have 85. You are a week out from fall camp. You've got to start figuring that out. What we now know is that it sounds like Scott Frost and his staff are going to be looking at, quote unquote, unconventional ways to bring those numbers down without essentially having to, have anyone necessarily leave. What you can do in those cases, which we've seen in the past, is if somebody is a one semester scholarship player, maybe you take the scholarship away from somebody for a semester with the promise that it returns, like based on different things. There are options that, are still going to be tough conversations for people to have. But when you're looking at that, especially Nebraska is already going to exceed what we originally thought this class, the numbers for this class were going to be, because they know that they need players in certain areas. So they're kind of banking on the fact that they're going to have turnover. We know that there will be turnover with the transfer portal, like Brandon mentioned, but at the same time, this extra COVID year is going to make things interesting because players can use that if they want to. And we know that, coaches can make hey, you might find more playing time somewhere else, but if somebody's happy in their current situation, they might just want to stick around. And that does make things more complicated as you're trying to recruit for specific spots and your senior class at number climb when you were maybe thinking we can only have this much, but now we're here. It does make things, it makes things particularly interesting when you're trying to manage those roster numbers.
Yeah, that used to be all so easy, right? Like you knew you could sign up to 25 a year. And we know there are like gray shirts and ways to like boost that number and back count people and all that. But basically you're 25 a year, not more than 85. So your number was pretty much set, and now it's constantly in flux. And maybe in another couple of years, the COVID piece of it, what you're talking about, kind of fades out of it. But even still, like the transfer piece of it, and I know the NCAA has changed the rules on how those are counted for a little bit as well. it's just, it's really, it's hard to get your arms around it at this point. And that's not just from like you and I trying to drop in and do it. I think it's hard for coaches and staffs to do it. So all of that stuff is, there's just a lot of balls in the air with these things. And, while a transfer may not be taking, in some cases, may not be taking a scholarship away from a specific recruit, if you can, well, it goes back to the wide receiver example, like if Nebraska doesn't end up, if Malachi Coleman goes elsewhere, say, and Nebraska all of a sudden has that scholarship that they'd already kind of allotted to somebody, if you can find somebody that you think is better ready to play right away in the transfer portal, well, maybe you just don't use that high school scholarship and save it for later. So these are all the kind of like things that are going on. I mean, I think in terms of the ability to get unconventional with how you get that number down, is a place where Nebraska's walk-on program probably helps it, which isn't the good part of the story that we like to hear. We like to hear about the guys that walked on and got those scholarships. That said, there's usually some flexibility with that. You mentioned one semester, there's some things they can do there. So we'll see what happens with how Nebraska gets down to that number, but they're going to have to do it here pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I can already feel the comments coming, and I welcome them. So if this is where your thoughts are, please don't be afraid to chime in on this. But I know, like in previous conversations that we've had around recruiting on our YouTube channel, people talk a lot about how the transfer portal has changed high school recruiting and made it more difficult. And look, you're not entirely wrong, because take O'Shawn Mathis and Garrett Nelson, for instance. If those two end up deciding not to use additional years after this one, Nebraska has basically already said they would be interested in looking at the portal to replace those two players, because you need somebody who can come in and immediately make an impact on the edge. And that becomes a question of like, well, where are we turning? Yes, developing someone out of high school is great. But if we can get somebody who can make an immediate impact, especially after potentially losing a O'Shawn or a Garrett Nelson, again, not knowing that that's what's going to happen. It's just, if that is the case, if that's the way that ends up going, you are looking at somebody who makes an immediate impact. So it does change the high school recruiting just a little bit. And so I can understand when people bring that up, and I can understand the frustration that some fans share on what is happening with high school recruiting as a result. And I do think at some point we will kind of find an equilibrium here where things will find a balance. More or less right now for Nebraska is trying, well, to be quite frank, Nebraska's 2022 recruiting class did not pan out the way that I think the Huskers really wanted it to. And so the portal became an answer to, find and plug in some key holes that were needed for this 2022 team. But at some point, depending on how things go, you would hope that you find an equilibrium between who you're taking from high school that can be developed over time versus who you can find that can make an immediate impact depending on departures. So all of that to say, high school recruiting is kind of in a strange place right now. And I don't envy any of the people, whether it's the staffs who are having to like kind of like just work through all of this and the numbers and everything else. And also for the players, it's really hard. And I can empathize with that. And I can understand when people bring that up to us as like, what is happening with high school recruiting? Because honestly, change is the biggest thing happening right now. And we don't know what it's going to look like 5 years from now. But I assume there will be a point where we will look back and go, it's kind of found a balance. We're just kind of in the thick of it right now.
Yeah, it's really crazy to think about, because just the trickle down effect of, okay, college coaches and staffs, and at a place like Nebraska or even Alabama is kind of the king of this, where you've got all of this support staff that you bring in to help not just with high school recruiting to evaluate guys, but now you've got transfer portal specialists at places across the country. If that's what it takes to understand it at that level, like what happens then to kind of the high school coaches who they've got their players that are like looking for some guidance? And they're like, well, it used to be like this is how you got recruited, and this is what you could expect. These are kind of the timelines. And now that I don't know what those guys are telling their players at that level. And it's pretty chaotic. I think so we all know the primary concern with this Nebraska football season. It's unique, I think, really maybe over the past 50 years of how clear it is of what Nebraska needs to do. And I'm not saying like, well, they got to win 7 games. Like there's some variability there, whatever you think, but it's clear Nebraska needs to show some improvement. And it kind of did what it had to do in the transfer portal to bulk up or shore up the roster to get it to the point where it needed to be. That's first. And if that doesn't happen, none of this other stuff matters. But it'll be interesting. Do you get kind of stuck on this transfer portal track? Because I think most coaches would prefer it to be, we bring in the high school guys we like, we develop them, and a little bit more of a traditional path. So everyone's trying to figure that out. It's kind of, I think back to the Bo Pelini years where Pelini was always pretty adamant. And, in Nebraska, then pre-early signing period would have a flurry of activity ahead of that February signing period. And that was because Pelini kind of believed strongly in seeing a guy's senior film. And that's just like almost totally gone now. And so you think back to what this is like for high school coaches or high school players. And it's like, you kind of got to what the topic of this video, you got to be ready to go by the summer before your senior year. So be ready to take visits in the spring. Hopefully you can do that. You can take official visits now if you've got people that are interested and willing to let you do that. But it's crazy that your final season of high school football may not matter as much. Well, it definitely doesn't matter as much as it used to. And what sort of players are getting missed? What sort of players that needed that senior year are kind of falling down the ladder a little bit.
And, this is honestly probably a separate conversation that we can dive into later, because then you start to look at the potential ramifications where those players that end up having outstanding senior seasons who come onto the radar late may not have a position. They may not have a spot for somebody in class. So maybe they sign with somebody in February, and then maybe you see them in the transfer portal a year or two down the road because they're looking at what their options are. And maybe they can go to the school that they wanted to originally, or somewhere where they feel like they can have a better shot at the NFL or whatever their next steps are. And so all of these things do eventually have ramifications, and it's representing a lot of problems that we don't necessarily have answers or solutions to. The only thing you can really hope, and this is kind of the fingers crossed by everything, whether it's NIL, the transfer portal, high school recruiting, is it's kind of like everyone right now, no one wants to lead on any of these things. So there's a lot of like, well, fingers crossed it all works out in the end. So for those high school players who are looking at their senior seasons, who haven't committed yet, they're probably feeling that pressure. You have a lot of empathy for them as they're kind of working through that, because the world of high school recruiting has changed. It will continue to change and evolve. So again, for those of you who bring this up quite a bit in our video, in our comments, we hear you. Like, it is something where it'll be interesting to see what it looks like even just a few years down the road, after we have a little bit more time to kind of like see this through. And I already know somebody is going to say they hate the transfer portal. Like, I can feel that comment, which is totally fine. I understand there's a lot of charged feelings around the transfer portal and what it's doing and all of the other things that kind of come with it with NIL. So we'll have to just keep diving back into these conversations. We have actually touched on a lot of these talking points recently in the recruiting notebook at hailvarsity.com. So if you want to just kind of look at why recruiting early and committing early is a big deal for not only the players, but then the schools themselves. Brandon had something on that last week. We do have the calendar, and what you need to know is we're looking into the season ahead as far as the quiet period once that begins and what we're looking at with schedule. And then we'll have plenty more to come. Some of you have brought up some great topics in the comment section, which are going to be future notebooks. In fact, one I am working on, I'd hope to have it done for Sunday, but it's taking me a little bit more time to work through. So we will get there. But heck, if you wanted to see where USC and UCLA compare to the Big Ten right now, did look at their recruiting rankings versus everybody else, thanks to a story that 24/7 Sports ran, and kind of went and redid the numbers based on recent recruiting activity. So yeah, we have plenty to go dive into at hailvarsity.com. We'd love for you to go read the notebook. And we thank Pinnacle Bank for sponsoring that every 5 days a week. But also leave your comments. Let us know what questions you have. You might just see them surface again in these videos, or they might show up in the notebooks. So we appreciate it. Brandon, as always, thanks for letting me pick your brain. We will be back next week with even more.
Thank you.